For this podcast, we're going to open up by asking those who can and are willing to be kind enough to donate to the podcast to my Patreon and become patrons. That's www.patreon.com/challengehistory. I will put the information in the bottom of the description, so those who did not hear it clearly can donate to become patrons. Who can become patrons to my Patreon page. That's donations start at $1 and go all the way up to $100, and every donation is really, really greatly appreciated. I am on disability, so it helps both the podcast and for me for personal income for being on disability. And there's a little more information if you head to the Patreon page itself about my personal condition that will give you a little more information about me. Now we can get back to the actual thing. Now today's podcast is going to be about the Eighth Amendment. Now, the Eighth Amendment is broken into three parts. Most people tend to focus on the third part, and they think that's the only important part, but there are three specific parts to it that make it very, very important. And each part needs to be considered very, very important. And these are very, very important to the way we need to view things. It states excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines be imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Now, when we view this, we need to view this each individual part specific to this. We need to view those individually. This is why they tend to group these together, as when they initially passed these things along with it, it was to essentially so they did not start with a number of amendments. There were an astronomical number of amendments that needed to be ratified. Otherwise, it would have been so many, it wouldn't have been to limit the powers of the actual government. It would have been so excessive, it wouldn't have been funny. And we look at the first one is excessive bail shall not be required. Now, this is something that I think that tends to be ignored quite often now, because we'll find this quite often use on people. And they'll use the point of where they don't want to essentially give someone bail by putting an excessive amount on it. Well, if you don't want to give the person bail because you view them as a risk, just deny them bail because they would be a risk to society. Frankly, it's very, very simple. Do not say that you're going to don't put an excessive bail on there, because that's basically not reasonable. And we're seeing that basically they're putting some of these excessive bails out there, and they're doing this by a lot of times notoriety of the people, and in certain cases, and or notoriety of the case, such as if the case has gotten more public attention, they'll put the bail at a higher amount. Whereas if the same crime were done with less, where the case had less notoriety, they'll put the bail gets set at a lower amount. Well, you should be having some type of standard to the bail. And this is where we get to the idea of excessive bail shall not be required, which is showing that basically that is essentially a constitutional violation. There should be some type, which is showing that there should be some type of uniform creation of bail for crimes, for individuals. Which is why we get to our why we're going over to our second part, which is nor excessive fines imposed. This is also limiting government power as well, which is saying that they cannot impose excessive fines. As we can see that a lot of government areas will do this to raise they'll do this to actually raise the revenue of the region, because of they're using so much public aid that's within that region itself, and that's not funded by the federal government, so they need to essentially make it up. So what they'll do is they'll use excessive fines, and this is much of what caused the boil over of the riots in Ferguson, Mississippi. When people state it was over Michael Brown, that was completely illegitimate. That had really nothing to do with it. It was actually over these points of these excessive fines they caused these people to riot. They weren't rioting over Michael Brown. They were rioting over the usage of excessive fines, because essentially they were kind of sick of the cops coming by and harassing them and essentially looking for things to fine them for. And if you look at region by region of Missouri, Ferguson was considered by far the worst area for excessive fines for the people. And when we saw that for basically this petty use of fining, you could see that was the actual cause that kind of led to the rioting. Where we saw with some of the other situations of areas such as Baltimore and some of the other cities, you could see that there were agitators that came in that caused these events, but nothing got really out of hand like Ferguson did. And you could see Ferguson was a little more natural rising, and that was the actual cause, when no one was willing to look at the actual natural cause. Natural cause being this these excessive fines. And it goes back to the idea of the government using essentially the idea of excessive charging of people for on a financial end for what they're actually doing, and making it uneven. Now, you'll find them do this on the prestige of crimes as well, because when people are charged of certain crimes, they'll actually say, well, this crime has had more prestige on it, such as, like, let's say, like a Roger Stone. Roger Stone being charged of this crime with it, he's basically being basically a person that has is no flight risk, because he doesn't have a visa or a passport. I mean, he has his wife is virtually deaf. he's not likely to travel because he has a couple of small dogs, so it'd be very difficult for him to travel, and he's a well-known person, so it's very, very difficult for him to go anywhere. So the idea of an excessive bail would not be necessary, and when you find that people like that doing excessive bails on guys like him, or basically saying that he would be such a thing like a flight risk, it would be insane. And that shows you right there that they're even arguing that he would be a flight risk. Well, where's he gonna go? He really can't go anywhere in the U.S. because he's so well known. He can't fly anywhere because he doesn't have a passport. He doesn't know how to fly a plane, so he can't fly on his own. And that this is where you get to the idea of going back to excessive bail. And you will find them do this and say, well, he's more well known, so we have to put the bail higher. Well, it really doesn't matter if he's more well known. You should keep it even, and it does as long as you have 1-to-1 on the crimes with it. Now, if the crime hasn't been committed before, or there isn't any recent history on the crime being committed, you need to you can adjust that accordingly to what you think is fair. But such as the Jussie Smollett case, where it has not been, in my opinion, in recent history that they've charged someone with falsifying a hate crime. So I think you could basically make cases for almost anything for the bail, as long as it's reasonable. I think anything around the up to that 100,000 mark would have been classified as, or even 200,000 mark would have been classified as reasonable, which would have released him at between $10,000 to $20,000, release him to the public. And without problems, because of his salary being upwards of $1.1 million, and him which would have not financially done any damage to him, and him also being a little bit of a flight risk, being that he's no longer essentially going to be working on that show. Him also being the case of where he was essentially potentially leading to what could have been a race war. So you needed to put it at some type of high enough level to make a statement saying this cannot be allowed. And then we get to the third one, is cruel and unusual punishments cannot be inflicted. Now, this is usually the one that's focused on, and I think this is, you can't necessarily always focus on this point. Now, this one usually is what ends up being focused on, and it tends to be really manipulated to what it actually means. You have to define, first of all, is what the meanings of cruel and unusual on punishment, and basically those are the two terms that you need to define first. If we go to those two terms right now, is cruel is basically supposed to inflict pain or suffering, or we go down to the second one, is causing or conducive to injury, grief, or pain. And then unusual is not usual, common, or rare. Basically, if we look at synonyms, antonyms, extraordinary, odd, out of the way, peculiar, rare, strange, unaccustomed, uncommon, uncustomary, unique, weird. Antonyms, which would be what would be lawful, would be common, ordinary, plain, or usual. So what we're looking at here is what would technically be lawful under this is basically, when we look under this is basically we're talking about something that would be continued pain beyond the beyond what the punishment would initially cause, beyond what would be a fair punishment. Now, if we're talking about capital punishment, it would be basically not essentially inflicting a prolonging punishment. Now, this does not include accidental prolonging. Now, that would not be considered as cruel and unusual punishment. When we have the cases of where we have lethal injection, where there were errors in the lethal injection and the way this thing was administered, that does not count as cruel and unusual punishment, because for cruel and unusual punishment there needs to be an actual intention behind it. If we're talking on it being for the cruel side, if we're talking about that, it needs to be it cannot be under the guise of accidental. Because if it's accidental, in that case, we're talking that it's cruel. It needs to actually have the point of being open, the openness of malice. And if there is no malice there, then the point of it being the idea of being cruel, it cannot be, because cruel needs to actually be completely aware of its own. To be cruel, you need to be aware of your own intentions. You cannot be essentially accidentally cruel. If you if you bump into somebody and they and they end up suffering from an injury, and you bump into somebody, then you keep walking with it. You never knew you bumped into somebody, and they end up injuring themselves and suffering from that injury for years to come. Is that being cruel? No, that's accidental, and that's totally incidental from being cruel. You're not cruel. But if you essentially do an actual harm in which you were in which that was your intentions to begin with, was to actually use the idea of a prolonged event, and not just basically make the capital punishment be as low amount of pain as possible, which basically goes against the idea of being cruel. And if you're just trying to basically make it quick, which is you're not going with the idea of torture, which is what cruel is essentially trying to state, is the idea of torture, which is what it's against. I mean, you're not supposed to engage in in events that are considered as torture, and as long as your points of whatever punishment it might be, if it's such as capital punishment, the capital punishment is if the actual intention was never torture, then it should be allowed to continue. Now, if you are aware of the repeated outcomes of being the same thing, like let's say a very either 100% or a high percentage of these things are becoming failures, and you're aware of it, and you continually do it, which means you're aware of it, and you know this stuff can happen, then that can enter in the idea of torture because you know this stuff can happen, and you're not addressing any possible solutions. Then that could go into the idea of being cruel because you're actually not addressing any possible solutions. Though people who have actually tried to even address solutions with it are a lot of times shot down because of there is a for those who actually do support the death penalty, there's a lot of people who've tried to do this, and there's ideas of like the Amnesty International have tried to shoot it down for basically when people are on death row. I'm saying for the people who do support the death penalty, and when these people are on death row, and we get to the point where it's almost forcing these people, saying, we're going to have lethal injection. Well, and they're not willing to accept alternative ideas. Well, we can actually have alternative ideas on that, and that's where we get to almost forcing this idea of this. And that's a lot of times where we get to some of these things which tend to be a little bit rough with it, and on the idea of these punishments. Now, when it comes to unusual punishments, it tends to be a little bit odd with it. What's technically unusual? Does this mean what does this entail? And basically, how far does this mean on it? Now, this is something that's usually not considered. And for what's punishments are they considering? Are they considering as long as this does not fit to torture? Is this okay? Like if you were made to such as maybe unique sentencing, would that fit? Because I've heard of people such as they're offered options of saying if you'll do you can either have the option of doing time in jail or entering the military. Well, that's a little bit of a unusual punishment of either serving the military or of military branch of your choice, or end up having such as a year in prison. Well, a lot of times people don't want the prison record, so they'll serve the military. And this is kind of unique, and that goes under being quite unusual. Well, does it mean that it's out of the box punishments that are handed down by judges all go under the unusual punishments inflicted? Or does it mean that we're talking about what would go under the idea of cruel punishments, of what would be considered cruel or torture, as long as it's not torture with it? Like, let's say if you are made to do some type of job or something, like instead of the actual an actual term in prison. Would that be and essentially swapping out essentially where you were paid just like normal with it, but essentially it made you kind of realize responsibility over that's over your actual time in prison. And I think that's where this part tends to be a little bit understood with it, and even by most with it, because at what point does unusual become out of the box punishments from judges to fit nonviolent solutions, or I shouldn't say nonviolent, but non-harsh solutions for people to avoid prison time, and where does it actually go? I think what they're talking about here with it, specifically how it's grouped up, is I think they're more, in my opinion, now this is where we start to go to opinions. I think what they're talking about here is specifically where they tend to go to what would be very, very weird and strange punishments that are essentially still going to the idea within the realm of cruelty, or maybe essentially what would be essentially more in the idea of cruelty or embarrassment. And I think that's what they're more referring to on unusual, specifically for the time. Now that this is not necessarily what would be normal for what I would normally discuss on this, but it's because of this term unusual is very, very non-specific, and that's why a lot of times this specific one is not usually debated. People usually go after this term cruel for what it is. They usually don't go after the term unusual, and that's something specific that I think needs to be discussed of what we actually determined is unusual. And I would like to see what the actual courts state on that, because there's going to be a lot of differences for what certain people state are these unique punishments that judges have handed down over the years, are those considered unusual punishments? Are those considered problematic? Or are we talking about things that would be considered embarrassing and things that would actually be considered on the idea of torture, such as embarrassing and degrading to oneself? Is that what would be considered as unusual? And just basically essentially limiting with this whole statement right here, just essentially limiting the theory of torture. Now if we take that idea of just eliminating torture, then we're talking that many out-of-the-box ideas of punishments could essentially be on the books, and that we would still have legal, technically, and capital punishment if we sit just in the realm of the Constitution. Though if we tend to go in some of the realms of the idea of the point of the Declaration of Independence, is we would tend to disagree with that point, and that's where it would not sit to where one could have that taken away. Though that's where we tend to view that it has to be done through trial. But I feel that if we do that, if we view it as that cannot be taken away whatsoever, I sit on the pro-life side for all points, and I feel that that's something that it cannot be taken away. Period. And I feel that is something that lives as a pure something that the government does not have the right to take away because of, for number one, for the actual inaccuracies on these things, and that is a right, and the government's essentially taking away a right based on essentially a trial, and the government should not essentially have the collective essentially rule on something which may or may not have happened to essentially take away your right to life. Now, you could still be condemned for essentially these heinous crimes, but not have your actual life being taken away. Which means you can give life without parole very easily, and which I completely agree with. But this does not necessarily, which means you can still have the potential to overturn any type of improper ruling. Now, if you like this discussion, which I know is kind of a little different from the previous ones, because there was one specific point which wasn't as clear, that we need to kind of define, but we really couldn't define fully on one of the points. But if you like it, subscribe, click the notification bell, share it on social media with your friends, and share it publicly. Try to see if you can't get them to subscribe as well. As I said before, I do have the Patreon. If you feel so inclined, make any type of donation per month that you can. That's very, very appreciated. Any type of amount. If you can get anybody interested in donating, that would be even more so appreciated, because that'll start give me some type of income that I can live on. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.